Sometimes, the greatest battles in the military are not fought on distant battlefields, but within the gates of our own bases. This is the story of Colonel Sarah Martinez, a leader who walked into a broken world, where discipline had crumbled, morale had vanished, and hope was in short supply. What she found was not just a failing military installation, but an opportunity to prove that true leadership is not about power, but about people. The sun had just begun its climb over the horizon when Colonel Sarah Martinez approached the gates of Fort Henderson. The golden light stretched across the worn pavement, casting long shadows on a place that once embodied discipline and pride. She wore no uniform that morning, just a white blouse, dark jeans, and walking shoes. It was a deliberate choice. She wanted to see her new command as it truly was, without the veil of ceremony that usually greeted incoming leaders. Her first impression was immediate, and it struck her like a quiet blow. The American flag at the gate drooped slightly, creased and wrinkled from being carelessly folded the night before. Around the guard shack, cigarette butts littered the ground, ignoring the no-smoking signs bolted to the walls. Inside the booth, two young soldiers carried on with their morning chatter, more focused on weekend plans and lukewarm coffee than the security of a major military installation. This was no small base. Fort Henderson housed over 5,000 personnel, families, and critical operations. Yet the first line of defense, the front gate, looked more like a neglected bus stop than the entrance to one of the nation's military strongholds. Sarah's heart sank. A gate was never just a gate. It was a statement, the very first reflection of the standards and pride of the people behind it. She stepped closer, her posture calm but commanding. Private Johnson, barely more than a boy with a fresh academy sheen still clinging to his posture, glanced up at her with irritation, as though she had interrupted something far more important than his duty. Sergeant Williams, slightly older, buried himself in paperwork, giving Sarah only the briefest acknowledgement. No salutes, no respect, no recognition of authority. "Can I help you?" Johnson asked, his tone flat, dismissive. Sarah placed her identification and transfer orders on the counter. She waited, silent, her eyes sharp but patient. The private picked up her documents with a sigh, scanning them as though it were a chore. When realization dawned on him, his confusion showed not as respect, but as suspicion. "Ma'am, this says you're a colonel," he said slowly, looking her up and down. "But you're not in uniform. I'm going to need to verify this." Williams finally looked up, his voice skeptical as he reached for her credentials. "Let me see those." His brows furrowed as he read her orders, clearly struggling to reconcile the civilian-clothed woman before him with the authority of the words in his hand. And then, against all reason, Johnson stepped forward, emboldened by his own inexperience. "I don't care what it says," he muttered. "This doesn't look right. You don't look like a colonel." For a moment, silence hung between them. Sarah could have pulled rank, demanded obedience, or called for higher authority. Instead, she breathed deeply, steadying herself. She had not come here to break soldiers. She had come to build them. "Private Johnson," she said, her voice firm yet calm. "The uniform does not define the officer. Bearing, discipline, and respect do. What you've just shown me isn't a failure of rules. It's a failure of culture. And that is exactly why I am here." The gate, wrinkled flag and all, had revealed the truth. Fort Henderson was broken. And this was only the beginning. The sound of tires on gravel broke the tense silence at the gate. A black sedan rolled to a stop, and 3 senior officers stepped out, their uniforms pressed and gleaming in sharp contrast to the slouched posture of the guards who had just fumbled their duties. Major Harrison's face was flushed with embarrassment as he snapped to attention, delivering a salute so sharp it seemed meant to erase the shame of what Sarah had just endured. "Colonel Martinez," he said firmly, his voice tight. "On behalf of Fort Henderson, I apologize for this completely unacceptable situation." Sarah returned the salute with crisp precision, her eyes steady. "Thank you, Major. But this situation is bigger than 2 soldiers at a gate." She glanced at Johnson and Williams, still pale and rigid at attention. "This is not about their failure. It's about ours." Her words cut through the air, forcing the officers to shift uncomfortably. Colonel Richards, the acting commander, approached the checkpoint and scanned the guard shack. His eyes lingered on the coffee cups, the clutter, the stale odor of neglect. His jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Sergeant Major Thompson's booming voice filled the air. "Are you telling me," he barked at the guards, "that a private overruled confirmation from this base's command because he didn't like how someone was dressed?" The weight of his anger pressed heavy on the young men. But before it could spiral into destruction, Sarah raised her hand gently. "Sergeant Major, Major, Colonel, before we let this become about punishment, I want to be clear. What happened here is a symptom of a larger disease. These young men are not the root cause. They are simply the proof of what happens when leadership disappears." Silence. Even the morning air seemed to hold its breath. Within the hour, Sarah was in a convoy with Richards, Harrison, and Thompson, driving through the heart of Fort Henderson. If the gate had been the warning, the tour was the evidence. Trash drifted along the edges of the commissary, unchecked and ignored. At the motor pool, half a dozen vehicles sat idle, rust creeping along their edges, repairs left unfinished. Soldiers strolled past with hands in their pockets, uniforms wrinkled, boots scuffed, their conversations casual and carefree. Training fields lay quiet, equipment neglected, as if the spark of readiness had long since died out. Even family housing showed signs of wear, lawns overgrown, paint peeling, small repairs left undone. This, Sarah thought, is not just disorder. It is apathy. Colonel Richards finally broke the silence. "Ma'am, you can see what we're up against. Leadership gaps, NCO transfers, morale at an all-time low. We've been in survival mode for months." Major Harrison added, his voice weary. "Every time we fix one crisis, another erupts. We're patching holes instead of steering the ship." Sergeant Major Thompson shook his head. "We stopped holding people accountable. Excuses replaced standards. And now this." Sarah listened without judgment, but her resolve hardened. She turned to them, her tone calm, yet uncompromising. "Gentlemen, I need you to hear me clearly. I did not come here to punish a base already bleeding from neglect. I came here to transform it. Fort Henderson does not need fear. It needs pride. And together, that is what we will rebuild." The officers exchanged glances, the weight of her words settling in. For the first time, a flicker of hope sparked amidst their shame. Fort Henderson's decay was real, but so was Sarah's determination. The first morning after assuming command, Colonel Sarah Martinez stood at the parade ground with the dawn mist still hanging low over the field. The base loudspeakers had called the formation, and slowly, unevenly, soldiers shuffled into place. Some wore wrinkled fatigues. Others whispered among themselves, unaware or indifferent to the presence of their new commander. Sarah watched silently, her hands clasped behind her back, absorbing the scene. It wasn't anger she felt, it was sorrow. These were good men and women, but they had been left without guidance, without standards to anchor them. A base without pride had bred soldiers without purpose. When the last stragglers stumbled into line, she stepped forward. Her voice rang out, steady and commanding. "Soldiers of Fort Henderson, I am Colonel Martinez, and as of yesterday, this is my command." The murmurs faded. She let the silence settle before continuing. "I have read your files. I know your records. I know the statistics that the world sees. Declining readiness, low morale, disciplinary issues. But those are just numbers. Numbers never tell the whole story. What I see is something deeper, potential that has been left untended. Seeds planted in good soil, but never watered." Her gaze swept the formation. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others held her eyes, curious. "Here's what I need you to understand," she said, her tone softening but carrying weight. "I am not here to break you. I am here to build you. Not through fear, but through pride. Not through punishment, but through purpose." She paused, then added, "And it begins today." That day, she walked the base personally, not with a clipboard, but with her sleeves rolled up. At the motor pool, she knelt beside grease-stained mechanics and asked what they needed to get their vehicles back in working order. At the mess hall, she sat at a worn table, eating the same bland food as the privates, listening to their frustrations about supplies and quality. At the training grounds, she picked up a rifle and joined the soldiers on the line, her aim crisp and steady. Everywhere she went, she sent the same message: "I will not command from an office. I will command from your side." That evening, Sarah called the senior officers into the conference room. The table was long, polished, but covered in dust, a symbol of meetings that had lost their meaning. She stood at the head of the table, arms folded. "Gentlemen," she said, You told me yesterday that this base is plagued by problems. You were wrong. What plagues this base is the absence of leadership. And that ends now. She outlined her plan, daily inspections not as punishment, but as accountability. Leadership presence on the ground, not just in offices. Refresher courses on standards and bearing, taught not with lectures, but with lived examples. Clear communication between units, so no soldier felt abandoned. Sergeant Major Thompson nodded slowly, his stern face softening. "Ma'am," he said, "if you lead from the front, they'll follow." Sarah's answer was quiet but unshakable. "I don't just want them to follow. I want them to believe." By nightfall, whispers had begun to spread across Fort Henderson. The new colonel was different. She didn't just demand excellence. She lived it. And for the first time in months, a spark flickered in the hearts of soldiers who had nearly given up hope. It had been 3 months since Colonel Sarah Martinez first set foot at Fort Henderson. In that time, the signs of change were undeniable. The flag at the gate flew sharp and crisp each morning. Guard posts were manned with discipline. Soldiers carried themselves with straighter backs. Uniforms pressed, boots shined. Pride was beginning to return. But transformation is never proven in moments of peace, only in moments of crisis. The crisis came on a humid Tuesday morning. A convoy exercise had been scheduled. Routine training meant to test vehicle readiness and communication between units. Sarah had pushed hard for this exercise, knowing it would expose weaknesses, but also reveal how far her troops had come. Halfway through the maneuver, the call crackled over the radio. Vehicle 3 down. Engine failure. Position Bravo 4. Moments later, convoy disrupted. Chain of command unclear. Requesting guidance. Sarah stood in the command tent, headset pressed to her ear, eyes narrowing. This was exactly the kind of breakdown that had haunted Fort Henderson months earlier. Poor maintenance, poor communication, hesitation under pressure. The officers around her stiffened, waiting for her order. But instead of barking commands, Sarah's voice was calm. "Patch me through to Sergeant Williams at Bravo 4. The line clicked. Williams' voice came through, tense but steady. "Colonel, vehicle disabled, convoy stalled. Johnson's trying to reroute comms, but..." Sarah cut him off gently but firmly. "Sergeant, you know the protocol. What's the chain of command? Who has authority on site?" A pause. Then Williams' voice, stronger now. "I do, ma'am." "Correct," Sarah said. "Then lead. Assess the breakdown, delegate the reroute, and get that convoy moving. I'll be monitoring." There was no panic in her tone, only trust. Minutes later, the convoy was back in motion. Johnson, once the defiant private who doubted Sarah's rank, had coordinated with mechanics to secure a replacement vehicle. Williams issued clear orders, and the soldiers followed without hesitation. The drill concluded only slightly behind schedule, but for Fort Henderson, it was a victory. When the convoy rolled back into the motor pool, Sarah was waiting. Dust clung to the vehicles, sweat streaked the soldiers' faces, but there was a new light in their eyes, confidence. She gathered them together. "Today," she said, "you proved something important. Not to me, but to yourselves. 3 months ago, this convoy would have collapsed under the weight of confusion and excuses. Today, you adapted. You led. You finished." Her gaze fell on Johnson and Williams. "And you too. You stumbled once at the gate when I arrived. But today, you stood tall. That is what growth looks like." The soldiers exchanged proud, tired smiles. For the first time, they were beginning to believe in themselves as much as their commander believed in them. Later, in her office, Sarah reflected on the day. The exercise had revealed lingering flaws, yes, but more importantly, it had shown resilience. The seeds of change she had planted were breaking through the soil. Fort Henderson was no longer just surviving. It was beginning to fight for its pride. 6 months had passed since Colonel Sarah Martinez's unorthodox arrival at Fort Henderson. The memory of that first day, the sloppy gate, the wrinkled flag, the guards who had nearly denied her entry, still lingered, but now it felt like a different lifetime. On this crisp autumn morning, Sarah once again approached the main gate. The transformation was stunning. The checkpoint gleamed with order, sandbags stacked with precision, logs neatly organized, and soldiers standing tall with immaculate uniforms. At the center of it all stood Specialist Johnson, once the nervous private who had questioned her authority. His salute was sharp, his eyes steady. "Good morning," "Colonel Martinez," he said with pride. "All security protocols in effect. No issues to report." Sarah returned his salute, her chest swelling with quiet satisfaction. "Outstanding work, specialist. Carry on." Where once there had been doubt and decay, now stood confidence and discipline. The gate, the symbol of Fort Henderson's broken culture, had become a symbol of its rebirth. Inside the base, the changes were just as profound. The motor pool hummed with efficiency, vehicles lined in perfect rows, each one fully mission-ready. Mechanics moved with purpose, their systems streamlined and their pride restored. In the dining facility, soldiers laughed and ate meals that were not only nutritious but prepared with care, menus crafted from feedback programs Sarah had introduced. Even the housing area had transformed. Families walked along clean streets, children played in safe yards, and homes were well kept. Pride had returned not just to the soldiers, but to their loved ones as well. But the true test of leadership isn't in appearances, it's in legacy. That afternoon, Sarah gathered her staff for the morning briefing. Reports flowed in, higher training scores, improved readiness ratings, dramatically increased retention. Morale was soaring. More than that, other bases had begun to notice. Delegations had visited Fort Henderson to study their methods, and leadership programs born here were being adopted across the region. "Ma'am," Major Harrison reported, "the Pentagon has officially selected Fort Henderson to host the annual Regional Leadership Conference. They specifically cited our transformation as a model for military excellence." Applause filled the room, but Sarah raised her hand gently. "Recognition is good. But remember, true success is not what others see from the outside. True success is what we sustain when no one is watching." Sergeant Major Thompson, seated near her, added with a grin, "Ma'am, the culture here has shifted. Soldiers aren't just following orders, they're owning their standards. That's how we'll sustain this." Later, standing by her office window, Sarah gazed across the base. The flag flew high and flawless, the same pole that once displayed neglect. Soldiers moved with purpose, a living reflection of discipline and pride. The gate incident had once threatened to define Fort Henderson as a place of failure. Instead, it had become the spark that ignited transformation. Johnson and Williams, once symbols of disorder, were now training others in professionalism and security. The lesson was clear: mistakes, when guided by the right leadership, could become turning points. Sarah smiled to herself. Her work at Fort Henderson wasn't just about fixing problems. It was about planting seeds that would grow long after she moved on. Because true leadership is not about managing the present. It's about building a future. And Fort Henderson was finally ready to stand tall in that future, proud, disciplined, and reborn.